Good afternoon and namaste. We're into the second phase or class of Ancestor Worship and Veneration. Started on Monday. I had an obligation yesterday, so we're going to cover a little bit more today. But I want to do a quick overview. So what we discussed on Monday is the fact that every culture, African, Asian, European, etc., all have practiced and continue to practice what is entitled ancestor worship or veneration. The distinction between the word veneration and worship in some of the cultures is very close or synonymous, and others the distinction. The word venerate or veneration means the highest regard for a particular individual and one who is deceased, making them an ancestor. We talked about in Christianity as an example, the word saint is used. Saint and ancestor are synonymous. Both individuals have expired or no longer exist on the physical plane. Both saints and ancestors that are venerated are done so because of the things that they have accomplished while on earth. For example, in the Roman Catholic Church and other forms of Catholicism as well, the Byzantine, the Greek Orthodox, etc., for an individual to be canonized, they should have done something that's considered to be a miracle, okay? As a matter of fact, oftentimes 2 miracles in the Roman Catholic Church are required, and someone has to validate them. There was much controversy, and so I may be in error as to whether or not Mother Teresa has been canonized, but I believe not. She has been placed in a category of beloved, which is the level just before complete canonization, because there is some squabble about the second miracle. So there's a little sidebar. Now, in any case, one of the principal things that a saint or an ancestor does is to intercede and intervene on behalf of those that are still in this physical realm. As we went on to talk, when we talk about other cultures, the ancestor role is first and foremost to intercede for the family that is left behind and the community. So those are the things. Ancestors and saints are synonymous. They've done something tremendous. They have a close relationship. Why? Because they have returned back to the source, i.e. God. All right? When we look at those we talked about, for those of us that have been raised Roman Catholic in particular, that we talked about the veneration of the saints, the angels, etc. Okay? And again, everyone wants someone to have your back. You know, if I use vernacular. You know, so those are the roles. Then we talked about the fact that every culture, in fact, practices that. I did a little spoiler alert earlier with Mother Stallings and mentioned that, for example, the Filipino people, I think I mentioned, they still practice forms of ancestral worship, even though they have claimed Catholicism. What you're going to find out throughout this I Am Institute, as all of the clergy of the AACC here in the capital/international region, is that we're connecting dots. And you will find, as we just did in the last Bible study, that much information is not meant to be literal, but in fact it has a higher goal in mind. And so it is, you'll find the correlation when we talk about ancestral worship or veneration. One of the things that is mentioned in some cultures a little more than others, for example, as we go through this, when we get down to the east, I'm going to cover Africa and some of the eastern countries and talk a little bit about what they do in their veneration. But you'll find that the ancestor is considered in some of the cultures to be a little god. Wow, imagine that. Because if you're forming and fashioning an image and likeness, what does that make you? I mentioned that you don't get oranges from an apple tree, you get an apple. A turtle gives birth to another turtle, etc., etc. So, again, we're talking spiritually. All of what we're talking about is a matter of faith. It is a matter of what you believe. As a man or woman thinketh, so he shall be. All of these things are connected. There are some things that cannot be proven by science. There are many things that can. But the higher things are those that are intangible, but they are directly connected in spirit. Any questions before I go on? Okay, very good, very good. So, West and Southeast African cultures. Ancestor veneration is prevalent throughout Africa and serves as the basis of many religions. It is often augmented by belief in a supreme being, prayers and or sacrifices are usually offered to the ancestors, who may ascend to becoming a kind of minor deity themselves. Ancestor veneration remains among many Africans, sometimes practiced alongside the later adopted religions of Christianity, for example, in Nigeria, among the Igbo people, and Islam among the Mahdi peoples, and Burma people, and the Burman and Bokisi people in much of the continent. In Orthodox Seer religion, the Panagon is venerated by the Seer people. So I'll go into a little more detail about that. The Seer people of Senegal and Gambia. And I just talked about a term called the Pangol people, or the Pangol, and that's P-A-N-G-O-O-L. Pangol in the Seer, or singular Fangol, plural, are the ancient saints and ancestral spirits of the Seer people of Senegal and Gambia and Monteria. The Polygon play a critical role in Seer religion and history. In a religious sense, they act as intercessors between the living world and the supreme being, or Rog or Kok. In historical sense, the ancient Seer village and town founders called Lamanis were believed to be accompanied by a group of Pangol as they traveled in search of a land to exploit. These Lamanis became guardians of the Seer religion and created shrines in honor of the Pangol, thus becoming the custodians of the Congo people. There are several Congo in Seer religions, and each one associated with a specific attribute have their own sacred places of worship, means of worship, etc. The symbol of the Pongo is the serpent, represented by two coiled snakes. And I start with that one because we just talked about the serpent in Genesis. The serpent, through all of antiquity, has had multiple roles. We were downstairs, the Archbishop and my mother had gone into the kitchen, and we were watching a medical show. And on the wall of this particular hospital, there's a symbol that everyone knows. There's a staff and there's two snakes coiled around it. We go back to the time when there was war going on, and the children of Israel had been bitten by snakes, and they were poisoned. But what cured them? Moses took the staff and the seraphat, or snakes, and held it up, winning victory. Also, those same snakes that had bitten them ended up being their salvation. The snake has been mostly presented as evil, but other cultures, the snake is venerated because it is cunning / or wise, and it gives information and healing. So there's a duality. And the higher picture with that is that duality is we have the capacity of doing what? Good or evil. So we'll find that, again, prior to Christianity or Judaism, there were other forms of religion. Some of it, most of it was done through oral tradition, and some was written down. While I'm on that note, there is much misinformation stating that the African peoples did not write things down, that they only practiced oral tradition, and in fact, that is not true. The oldest known university to mankind is in Timbuktu. The Greeks and the Romans studied at the feet of the African who wrote those things down. Yes, ma'am. Exactly. What is that? Oh, absolutely. See, again, and we mentioned this in the first class, and we will often mention it. For those people who think that there's an attack, particularly in the AACC or any other faith community or organization that has Pan-African or pro-African or pro-indigenous people, it's not an attack on Western civilization or European information. It is a correction. Because again, to destroy a people, you take away their identity. The first thing that, going back to the previous class, when the trickster, the first thing he did was attempt to confuse Eve and give what? Misinformation. So when you misinform someone and you do it over an extended period of time, there's an expression, if you tell a lie long enough, people begin to believe it as the truth. Because the truth oftentimes seems to be strange. And so what happens is misinformation turns into lies. Because again, I don't want you to know your true identity. For example, and I don't know if the Archbishop covered it, I'll mention it briefly as we go on, but, well not but, and the original peoples created most things. Now, we know, we've discussed that there is both polytheism and monotheism. And the European, well, not the European necessarily, but the Jew is given the recognition of being the first to be monotheistic. But in fact, that is not correct. Monotheism, like everything else, came out of Egypt. There was an understanding that there is one God that's creator, and in ancient Kemet, that name was Ra. Monotheism began with one of the pharaohs. No, but Imhotep is misrepresented, for example, in the Mummy series. Imhotep was a physician and a mystic, but in that movie, he's misrepresented as being an evil person. Because again, I can't tell you that you're fabulous. I can't tell you that you're beautiful. I can't tell you that you are the seat of all of civilization and then try to control you. Because you say, well, you can't because I'm actually your daddy. You know, our children, our grandchildren become wise, but it comes out of our seed, it comes out of our lineage. And so, therefore, this whole piece of obedience, etc., is always to the one who precedes you. Now, there's evolution, but you always have to go back to the source because it continues. In any case, in Madagascar, oh, I'm sorry. Sister, you had a question or a comment. Right. Yes. So hieroglyphics are what? Information. That's writing. They talk about finding cave writings in Eastern Europe. Well, we talked a little earlier about evolution. When the world was continuous, the entire world before earthquakes split things, and you could walk from one place to the next, the European comes out of us. We had migrated and gone to various places. By the time we went to a very cold part of the world, very cold climate, it changes over a period of time your physical attributes. If you go somewhere, if you move north where there's less sunlight, your complexion will eventually become lighter because you're not having as much sun on you. If you look at the continent, if you look at the Caribbean, not all, but a vast majority of people are dark or medium. The lighter folk come along out of interrelationship. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that by any stretch of the imagination, but depending upon where you are, for example, if you really go north and you look at Scandinavian countries, fair-skinned people, pale, don't have the same intensity of the sun. It's just because of where you are geographically. It's colder. If you've noticed, many of our European brothers and sisters really don't care that much about being in the sun. They'll go out and play in the beach for a moment. But when it gets above 75, and I'm not talking about just humidity, they become very uncomfortable. It's too hot. Now, again, these comments are just observations. They're not a better or a less than. I'm going to go there and then I'll get back on point. One of the challenges when we sometimes look at our European brothers and sisters, some, and I'm talking individually, not systematically, and systematically. Part of the problem is twofold, one of which is when you have a cold climate, you only have a short season to gather food. You don't have certain vegetables or trees, and so there's some lack. And there's a scarcity mentality that comes out of lack. When you are in a warm climate, you don't have that lack because everything is growing almost 12 months of the year, 10 for certain. And if you're in sub-Saharan or other tropical environments, I mean, there's always fruit. There's always something to eat. But when you come from an environment where you don't always have something to eat, and if you weren't able to harvest and hunt and gather and so forth, when you come to really extreme, everyone in this room, if you get real hungry, do you not get cranky? Well, when you go without, you get a little cranky. You're cold and you're hungry. Oh, that's a rough combination. But back to ancestral worship. In Madagascar, veneration of the ancestors is prevalent throughout the island of Madagascar. Approximately half of the country's population of 20 million currently practice traditional religion, which tends to emphasize links between the living and the Raza, as they call it, or ancestors. The veneration of ancestors has led to widespread traditions of tomb building, as well as in the highland practice of Famadia, whereby the deceased family member's remains may be exhumed periodically to rewrap the fresh silk shrouds before being replaced in the tomb. The Famadia is an occasion to celebrate the beloved ancestors' memory, reunite family and community, and enjoy a festive atmosphere. Residents of the surrounding villages are often invited to attend a party where food and rum are typically served, and haspa troupe or other musical entertainment is commonly present. Veneration of ancestors is also demonstrated through adherence of fadi, taboos that are respected during and after the lifetime of the person who established them. It is widely believed that by showing respect for the ancestors in these ways, they may intervene on behalf of the living. Conversely, misfortunes are often attributed to ancestors whose memories or wishes have been neglected. The sacrifice of Zubu is traditional method used to appease or honor the ancestors. Small everyday gestures of respect, including throwing the first capful of newly opened bottle of rum to the northeast corner of the room to give the ancestors their due share. I mentioned that we would look at pop culture, movies, things of that nature. In the movie Coolie High, what happened? There was a pouring of a libation, it was wine. In certain African cultures, depending upon whether we're talking the Yoruba or the Akan, and there's others, either rum or gin is utilized, depending upon which temple, what they call for. Those two liquors are used more often than any others. Then comes wine, and if you don't have a spirit, then water. But water would be the last. But they're used in ancestral worship. When we pour the libations at the beginning of every service, we use wine. I've been to some traditional African ceremonies where the priest or the high priest utilized rum, where they utilized gin. And so here you have it. And again, you have this whole thing of intercession, looking out for the family or community. It's a theme, yes. It's I'm going to say it's devastating. For example, they talk about these practices, and it's to remember, right? When you forget your past, when you forget your foundation, then you can take on practices that are not yours. Family is extremely essential. It's where you get your first knowledge. Your first teacher is your mother, your father, your grandparents, your grandmother, your grandfather, an elder. That's family, because family and community are intertwined. When you go either in the deep south or I'm up in the hills, right? The first place that I lived on Bull Run Road down in West Virginia, a little small town called Masontown. And on Bull Run Road, and I'm not embellishing, 90% of the people, and this is probably about a, Bull Run was probably 5 mile stretch. 90% of the people who lived on Bull Run were related to one another. We've been convinced, oh, that's clannish. Look at that. Oh my goodness, that's safety and security. Now the houses are far apart, most. I mean, there's a clump. There'll be 4 or 5 houses, but there's room. But stop and think about it. If someone has to go to the doctor, you've got multiple people that can get them there. You don't have to go hire a babysitter. You call auntie, cousin, elder brother, or sister to come and do that. When you go down south, most people live in communities where there's family. Even up north, I was having a conversation with my wife, and she was giving me some of her family history on her dad's side. And there was 2 blocks in which 70% of the people on the block were related to one another. I'm sorry, it must have been. Well, no, actually, I'm talking, well, in Brooklyn too. But in this case, I'm talking Baltimore. I'm sorry, I didn't mention where. But the larger point there is that here we've been convinced of not having generational family houses. Oh no, you have to have a single family home. Just the husband, the wife, the 2 kids, the dog, maybe a cat or 2. But that's not generally what most cultures do or did. Some are returning. So to answer that, I mean, it's devastation to not understand the importance of those that came before you and the things that they did. Everyone in this room, I guarantee, and I'm probably the youngest person in the room, but I can remember before leaving the house, I was told, don't disrespect God, don't embarrass the family, don't do what other folk do because you representing us, and behave. Use your, I mean, all of those things. Well, that's reinforced when you live in a community where you know everybody. So if they're not biologically related, there's still kinship because you probably go to the same church. You're involved in the same organizations. The whole point, one of the largest points of ancestral worship, regardless of culture, is to remember those before you and those that are elders, because they look out for you at a much higher level now that they are in spirit realm, now that they're reconnected with God. Some folk, when they come in here and they hear that, when we teach this and preach this, it's unfamiliar because it's been taken away. So Sister Teresa, all those years that was taken away is why we are where we are. Please. Okay, you're correct. And so you talk about, for example, the royal family and how they venerate, because they do. In secret, they use the term ancestor. Ancestors what? Nothing but family that's no longer in this plane. So we gotta take away the spookiness that has been given to us. There's also a reason. It's not off topic. It's connected. There's a reason that she was allowed. She's not the first individual of African descent to be married into that royal family.
Yeah, but the point that I was making is the fact that there was none of her family
Sure.
in a married in a family where family was everything, ancestors were everything.
Because when you go to the big house and you're allowed in the big house, some will abandon what they, if in fact she was educated to understand the importance of family. Yes, please.
I don't think she abandoned her family. You know, sometimes you got strife in your family, so sometimes you have to let the dust sit over there and you stop. You know what I'm saying? I don't, because she was already saying she had problems with her father, she had problems with her cousin, and a lot of strife. And people, sometimes as black people, we are jealous when you go. I feel that you owe me something, but you don't. The Bible tells you to work anything you want, you got to work for it. So I had to work for this, but I want this authority. You know, I'm this, I'm that. But when you're not,
You know, things I have come to learn that things are a matter of perspective. Okay? And sometimes whether she abandoned or they abandoned or it was a combination, and sometimes you do have to leave folk behind. One of the things that Jesus said when he was about to teach, and one of the disciples said, Master, Master, your family's, all of your family's not here. And he said, my family are those who believe as I do. Well, I mean, but again, here's the thing. One of the challenges that we can have when we begin to dissect and to look at origins, because this whole point about ancestral worship and veneration is to talk about the origins, because as I mentioned earlier, that just about every religion and every culture has practiced this. So the point in me being interested in teaching this course is so that we can prayerfully, and I don't mean anyone in this room, but we as a people, that we can do two things. One, that we can learn that this practice is ancient and that it is multicultural, that it does not belong to one segment of the world population. What happens with systems who attempt to control, and in this point, when I say systems, I'm not just speaking of European systems. Every system, every group of people has a segment of those in power that want to subjugate the masses. And the way to do that is to take away their history. Okay, so it's not just within the context of the African American community, the European, every culture, it's part of our challenge as being spiritual beings practicing to be human. We forget. And so what happens is these kinds of questions, and they're good questions. What happens and how it's part of human nature. I was having an earlier conversation. I've had it a couple times this week. For the last 10 years, I have refused to use the term black on black crime. Because in fact, crime takes place in every community. For the most part, people live in groups of homogeneity or likeness. Homo means same. So, let's look at Arlington or Alexandria, or for that matter, Yesterday, in coming back from work, I ended up on the way here getting real low on gas, so I had to pull over, and so ended up down in Langley Park, Maryland. Langley Park right now, probably for the last 10 years, is predominantly Hispanic, but multiple Hispanics. So you've got folk from Honduras, you have a whole lot of El Salvadorians, you have some Puerto Ricans, not a whole lot, but you have whatever section Honduras, what country's neighboring them? But anyway, you have a lot of folk from that part of South America that had immigrated and they found their way here. Part of that was systematic because it started with a heavy group of El Salvadorians coming in. That's related to the Iran-Contra thing. The whole gang of MS-13, those El Salvadorians were part of the military that were doing the fighting. So when they first came, they weren't well accepted. And so they formed, quote unquote, a gang to protect one another. Later, it branched out into a criminal enterprise. One of the things that I love about movies is they're always trying to tell you a real story. If you have not seen, there's a movie came out, I want to say late 90s, give or take, and it was called The Gangs of New York. And it really does chronicle how many of those gangs came to be. The Italians, the Greeks, everyone. Because if you were in a, again, homogeneous, you're in a section of town with all of your people. A few blocks later, there's a bunch of other people. Different ethnicity. They clump together, they protect one another. It later turns out of corruption into something else. If those people, all of them, because all of them did, it's going to be very interesting because many of us don't think that the European ever practiced or still practices ancestral veneration. They do, some in code, some not. So we're definitely going to get to that. So again, everything, as I mentioned in the first session, everything comes from the sacred down into the natural or the profane. And when we forget those principles, when we forget those edicts, I dare say those commands of obedience, this is what you get. You get chaos and confusion. When we look at laws, both spiritual and mankind, the intent is for protection. The intent is for your well-being. And then when you don't, then you get what you get. For some. The Yoruba. Mm-hmm. Mm. No, please don't. Because again, no, but you're not. But you're not. And again, the larger point, see, there's a practical application to every religious thing. There's symbols. There's suggestions and recommendations. So when you talk about ancestral worship and veneration, okay, they're doing their part in the spirit realm. When we remember, when we call upon, we're talking about the best of, and that's always to educate. That's always to nurture. That's always to care for. I meant to mention you because you were counting, and one of the things that my mom and older siblings would say was also, don't embarrass the race. We were told that. And so, because he felt a comforting spirit.
You know what I said? Okay, Father.
Yeah, and you
Watch
have to
this.
understand.
Look at him now. Look how I make it. I look at him, he never passes, he's always. And I think maybe I, maybe we need, there's two more little boys I want to pray because I'm not taking away your service, but the girls, yeah, right, but them boys, I need.
So here, so
And I need them so I can teach them to walk and respect their elders.
It's a gradual thing. It's a gradual thing. It's not like we're not when we're taking them into Sunday school that we're not trying to get them to the point where we can see them in a better light. But we have to understand that the schools, what they're getting from the homes, what the school is feeding them before they get in here. And the thing is that like one little boy was so unruly, and the first thing another little girl said, well, why don't you just give him back to your grandma, his grandma? I mean, and then that's what he wanted. But that wasn't what I was going to have, you know. So it's like they going for a whole lot, you know. And a lot of them coming in here, and you say, and I say, what's wrong with this person? And they say, oh, she partied last night. I'm saying she was just about 7. What are you talking about? You know, so it's a whole lot that's out of their control and that they're victims of as a result.
you're not, by any stretch, no one, you're not interrupting. This is part of the process. I'm not doing a lecture. I'm giving you some information, and I'll tell you where you can get it, you know, for future reference. But the whole point of real education is that back and forth. That's what we do. So no one has to apologize because what you're saying is where I'm going. Again, I'm going to go back to destruction, right? When you destroy a people, the first people attacked are the male. Any society, doesn't matter. So we sometimes look at, and it's true, now don't get me wrong, the African American male, the black man is definitely under attack. But so too is all men, other than the European, and the European that's under attack are those that are poor. I often ask the question, because I work with young people, I ask them who's in jail. They say black and brown people, blacks and Hispanics. I said, yeah, but y'all got some white boys up here in this facility. But who are they? The largest percentage of people detained, whether they're juvenile or adult, are poor, uneducated people. And they are utilized, some of the major furniture companies. The furniture is not made in a factory, it's made in a prison. That's the new factory. License, I mean, so there's a method to that. Sister Teresa, you are correct in that patience is required. Because oftentimes, as you mentioned, when we're dealing with young people, when we're dealing with young adults, when we're dealing with some allegedly they're chronologically adult, but spiritually not, maybe mentally not, because there's been deficits. I don't know all of anyone in this room's backstory, but you got one, and the backstory could be tremendous. You could have come up in a family in which there were certain traditions, and when I say that, I'm speaking first and foremost church, and then community, etc. That may have been a part of your upbringing, but it also may not have been. And so when we engage in interaction with one another, one of the things that we have to learn to do is be patient. When we go to 1 Corinthians 13, that love chapter, right? The very first thing that it says, and please forgive me, I'm going to say it's verse 4, it may not be, maybe 5. But when it starts saying what love is, the first thing it says is love is patient. I don't care whether you're talking about New American, King James 1 and 2, any of those, even the hip hop one. The very first thing it says is love is patient. If the supreme being, if God were not patient, we would cease to exist, because it is very incremental to get to a level of spiritual maturity. Some grasp some things immediately, or what appears to be immediate, and others it may take a moment because they haven't let go of the miseducation, not that they had, but their parents or their grandparents. Ignorance is not just a matter of formal education. It is the not knowing of information. When you know better, you do better. But if you don't know, you can't. So again, and I'm not going to hold you, 2 more pieces of information, and we'll pick it back up. But again, that is the whole point of this, is to understand that every culture has had some form of ancestral worship. And then it's played out based upon cultural norms and mores. But the interconnectedness, again, is the intercessory part, the acknowledgement of what they brought to the family and community. And it plays out in every culture. In Cambodia, in Laos, in China, in Korea, in Japan, in Indonesia, in India, and I'll go through a few more examples the next round. But what you'll find is some similarities. I promise, because the question was asked, on the next session, I'll look at some of I'll give you some examples of some of the altars that are set up and some of the practices. For example, in Christianity, right, particularly Catholic, Episcopalian, Lutheran, and Methodist churches, All Souls Day, Saints Day. What's the number one thing that are done? What's All Souls Day all about? Remembering the saints. What's the Day of the Dead? That was a sanitized way of having ancestral worship within Catholicism, within Christianity. So see, you went a couple ahead, and that's good. The point in mentioning that is that it continues to take place. All Saints, All Souls Day. Veneration of the ancestors, of the saints, of those that came before you. Remembering them. There was a movie, and I can't remember the name of it, and it was really good. It came out a couple years ago. It was in cartoon form. It was the Day of the Dead. And it was about how the Mexican practiced the Day of the Dead. Now, some of that got sanitized, but the point is, there's certain cultures, for example, that go out to the gravesite, and the entire family goes out. and they remember, and they bring sacrifices, they bring offerings. All right? They light candles, they burn incense, there's drumming. All of these things to include them. When I talked about the people that in Madagascar and in Gambia, they dig up the grave and they rewrap. Now that's not comfortable for some people because it's not what you're used to. But when you're used to a thing, it's something different. If we look at foods as an example, exotic food, right? Escargot. It's a snail. Right. But if you grew up in a culture in which it was normal, that's what you do. Caviar, red and black, right? They're eggs. They're eggs from a fish. You know, about in the mid 80s on to now, that's a delicacy. That was the word I was looking for. These delicacies. Well, now our European brothers and sisters eat what was given to us for sustenance. Chitlins, entrails. It's all kind of names for it, but the point I'm making is that at one point, that was given to us because they weren't going to give us the steak. They weren't going to give us the ribs. We weren't even going to get a pork chop. Eat this. Okay? But now, upscale Whole Foods and places of that nature, we have pork bellies. Well, what the heck is a pork belly? So the point I'm making is, even when we talk about different forms of veneration that are unfamiliar to us, it's unfamiliar because it was taken away. There's a strength in family. There's a strength. The scripture talks about if you have a cord and it's got 3 layers to it, it's harder to break than a single strand. All these things get connected. I thank you very much for your attention and appreciation. We're going to look a little more with Asia, to include both China, etc., and even East Asia, which is India. And when we get into India, and I don't know, I'm pretty sure that the Archbishop mentioned, and I mentioned I was with some friends yesterday. Quick question. Of the big 5, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, which of those is the oldest religion? Hindu is the oldest religion. As it relates to those. And the predecessor of all of those is the various practices that come out of Kemet or Kush that then go into the other names of that region. But of the big 5, as I call it, because we always talk about the big 3, but of the big 5, the oldest is Hinduism. Thank y'all very much. God bless you. May you continue to be protected. Love you dearly.